She sat too close and said, "Relax, or don't." My chest tightened before I could even process the words. I was supposed to be fixing the shelf behind the counter, stacking new arrivals with my usual half-attention, but suddenly every sound, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights, the scrape of cardboard under my fingers, felt louder, sharper, like it was punctuating the space between us. She didn't smile. Not exactly. But her eyes, dark, deliberate, the kind that looked like they'd cataloged every detail of every person they'd ever met, were fixed on me, and I couldn't look away. There was a tilt to her head, a quiet confidence in the way she perched at the edge of the chair, that made the small repair shop feel both suffocating and electric. I cleared my throat. I think it's fine. My voice sounded small in the cavernous silence that had fallen, even though we weren't supposed to be alone. There were deliveries, the bell over the door jingling every few minutes. But somehow it felt like she'd drawn a circle around just us. "Fine," she repeated, her tone curious, not mocking. She leaned a fraction closer, enough that I could see the faint crinkle at the corners of her eyes, the soft curve of her jawline, and the faint perfume lingering in the air between us. "Fine is boring." I swallowed, trying to focus on the stack of books in my hands, but my fingers trembled slightly. The titles blurred into one another. I wanted to glance up, but when I did, she caught me, and there it was, the kind of look that made you feel both exposed and understood, like she could read the quiet panic I tried to hide behind casual movements. Her hand brushed against mine as she reached for a notebook across the counter. It was accidental, I told myself. Purely accidental. But for a moment, it lingered, and I could feel the warmth seeping through, a subtle acknowledgement that she knew exactly what she was doing. "I like how you organize things," she said, tilting her head so her hair fell across one shoulder, catching the overhead light. "Not just the shelves, everything. Neat, quiet, predictable. Until now." Her gaze flicked up at mine again, and I had to look away, pretending to adjust a crooked spine, though my heart had skipped a beat I wasn't ready to admit. We were quiet after that. The kind of quiet that isn't empty, but loaded, full of what-ifs and half-finished thoughts. I caught her watching me out of the corner of my eye, and I couldn't tell if she was amused or just waiting for me to say something, or do something, or perhaps not do anything at all. When she finally stood, it was slow, deliberate, and she didn't step back. She leaned slightly over the counter, just close enough that I could feel her presence without touching. "You're staring," she said softly, not accusatory, not teasing, just stating a fact. I started and then stopped. Words failed me, as they always seemed to when she was around. She smiled then. Not a full smile, just a slight curve of her lips, the kind that made it impossible to tell what she was thinking. And then she walked away, leaving me with the faint scent of jasmine, the echo of her voice, and a pulse I couldn't ignore. I stayed there, holding a book that suddenly seemed heavy, wondering why a single sentence, so simple, so casual, could lodge itself in my mind and refuse to leave. Relax, or don't. I didn't expect to see her again so soon. The repair shop felt smaller this time, almost intimate, like the walls themselves had drawn closer. She was crouched by the window, adjusting a display of notebooks, sunlight catching the soft streaks of gray at her temples. Her movements were precise, almost ritualistic, but there was a weight to her shoulders that hadn't been there the last time. I started stacking books quietly, trying not to interrupt, but I couldn't help glancing at her every few seconds. She noticed, of course. She always did. She glanced over her shoulder with that same calm, knowing expression, and I felt my chest tighten. "You're early," she said without looking at me. Her voice was softer this time, edged with something like hesitation. I wasn't sure. I just wanted to help," I murmured, fumbling with a box of paperback novels. Her lips twitched, maybe a smile, maybe the ghost of one. "Help is dangerous," she said lightly. Then, after a pause, she added, "You might get caught up in something you don't understand." Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted a stack of journals. I noticed it immediately, the subtle shake, the way she kept pressing them against her chest as though to steady herself. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but the words lodged somewhere in my throat. Instead, I just watched. There was a quiet vulnerability in that small tremor. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, but it was enough to make the air feel heavier between us. She shifted her weight, and I caught the faintest sigh, almost inaudible, almost private, and my stomach tightened. "You pay attention to small things," she said suddenly, not looking at me, but speaking as if she'd read my thoughts. "Most people don't. Most people just see what they want to see." I nodded, unsure if I was supposed to reply, but I kept watching because I couldn't stop. I noticed the faint lines around her eyes, the gentle scar along her wrist, the way she pushed her hair behind her ear even though it never stayed. She laughed once at a passing delivery guy, quiet and brief, and it made the shop feel warmer, though the winter sunlight through the glass was already doing that too. We fell into a strange rhythm. I stacked, she arranged, and neither of us spoke much. And then she paused, mid-step, fingers hovering over a pile of sketchbooks, like she was deciding whether to reach for one or put it down. I imagined all the things she might be holding back, thoughts, regrets, hesitations, and I wanted to reach across that tiny space between us and let her know it was okay. But of course I didn't. Instead, I caught her gaze, fleeting but direct, and she held it just long enough to make me aware of the electricity in the quiet room. Her chest rose and fell, slow and controlled, but I noticed how tired she looked, how carefully she carried herself. And even as she shifted her weight and turned away, I could feel the pull, like gravity had sharpened in her direction. She stopped at the counter finally, and her hand brushed against mine this time, softer than before. I didn't pull away. She didn't either. The moment lingered, suspended in sunlight and quiet breaths, fragile and charged at once. Then she whispered, more to herself than to me. "Some things are worth noticing, even if it's dangerous." I swallowed, and somehow, just that line, fragile, guarded, yet inviting, left me thinking about her for hours afterward. The rain started just after 6, tapping against the window in uneven rhythms, loud enough to make the small office feel separate from the world. She was sitting across from me, a mug of coffee warming her hands, and for a moment, the air between us was thick enough I could almost reach across and touch it. "I didn't expect anyone else to be here," she said, her voice quieter than usual. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, but it didn't hide the way her eyes lingered on mine longer than necessary. I wanted to say something that wasn't about the stack of papers we were supposed to be sorting, but I didn't. I kept my hands on mine, folded neatly, and pretended to focus on the documents. Every once in a while, my eyes flicked up, catching the curl of her hair at her neck, the slight tremor in her hands as she lifted her mug. There was a flash of lightning, bright and sudden, and we both flinched. I laughed softly, trying to cut the tension. She did too, but it was half laugh, half breath. And then there was that pause, awkward, suspended, and for a heartbeat, the world outside didn't exist. Just her. Just the way her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to say something, but didn't. I noticed how close her chair was to mine, just a fraction too close. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, a mix of something floral and sharp, and how my chest tightened at it. I wanted to reach across and touch her hand, just to see if it was real, but I didn't. Instead, I stared at the papers, pretending the words mattered more than they did. And then, an interruption. Her phone buzzed loudly, breaking the spell. She glanced at it, eyes darkening for a moment, and I recognized the number, a name from the past she'd mentioned once, fleetingly. She hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen, and I realized she was debating whether to answer. "I should," she started, then stopped. Something passed over her face, frustration or regret. I couldn't tell. She ignored the call, setting the phone face down, but the moment of vulnerability lingered in the room. I wanted to ask her if she was okay. I wanted to reach across and say, "You don't have to carry it alone," but I stayed frozen. She had a way of making restraint feel like necessity, and I obeyed it without thinking. The storm raged outside, sheets of rain blurring the city lights. We worked in silence, shoulders brushing occasionally as we reached for the same folder. I could feel her breath, steady but close, and it made my fingers itch to close that small distance. Finally, the quiet stretched too long. I looked up at her, and she met my gaze, just for a second longer than expected. The unspoken question hung there. What if we let it happen? I felt it in the tightening of my chest, the flush rising in my ears. Her hand brushed mine again, not accidental this time, I was sure, but the moment was shattered by a sudden knock at the door. We both jerked back instinctively, as if someone had caught us doing something forbidden. She smiled faintly, a little self-conscious, and whispered, "Some things aren't meant to happen yet." I nodded, swallowing the urge to argue with fate itself. And yet, for the rest of the night, every time I moved my hand, I felt the ghost of hers against mine, closer than it had any right to be. The tension is primed here. Proximity, restraint, almost confession, but external pressure keeps it from tipping over. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but neither of us moved to refill it. The office smelled faintly of paper and rain, and the silence between us had thickened into something almost tangible. I could feel it pressing against my ribs, heavy and insistent, like it was waiting for one of us to break. "I can't not say it," she finally murmured, eyes fixed on the rain streaking the window. Her fingers drummed lightly on the table, precise and nervous, betraying the calm she'd tried to wear all day. "I don't know why, but this feels wrong. Or maybe it's right. I can't tell anymore." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. I feel it too. It's confusing. But maybe that's the point." My hands twitched in my lap, itching to reach out, but I stayed still, honoring the unspoken boundaries between us. She glanced at me then, and for a moment, her usual confidence slipped. Her eyes softened, vulnerable, and I realized how much I wanted to memorize that exact expression, how fragile it made her look. "We're not supposed to be here," she said softly. "Not like this. But something keeps pulling us closer, and I hate it." Her words felt like a confession, though not one about desire. More about being caught in a current she couldn't name, a gravity she couldn't fight. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't afraid, that I'd let that pull drag me anywhere, but I didn't. I only nodded, letting the silence do the speaking for me. The rain outside fell harder, drumming against the glass like it had its own pulse. She leaned back, eyes scanning the ceiling, and I noticed the small lines of fatigue around her mouth, the tension in her shoulders that hadn't eased all day. "Do you ever feel like everything we're doing is temporary? Like any second, someone or something could snap the illusion?" I did feel that, and yet, being near her made the illusion feel sacred, fragile, but alive. "Yes," I admitted quietly. "But maybe illusions are the only things that make sense right now." Her laugh was soft, almost a sob, a strange mixture of humor and despair. She reached for her coffee absent-mindedly, letting her fingers brush against mine. Barely, almost intentionally, but the touch lingered long enough to make my heart stutter. "We can't pretend anymore," she said, and there was something in her voice, raw and unpolished, that caught me off guard. "Not about this, not about us. I don't even know what us is." I wanted to say something to anchor us in reality, or at least in honesty, but no words felt enough. Instead, I just looked at her, and she looked back, and the room held its breath along with us. Finally, she whispered, almost to herself, almost a warning, "I don't want to ruin everything, but I don't know if I can stop thinking about you." The words hit me like a punch, tender and devastating. I wanted to reach for her, to reassure her, to stop time, but I only let my hands rest in my lap. The silence pressed in again, heavier than before, but now it was charged, raw, impossible to ignore. And somehow, despite the quiet, despite the restraint, despite the uncertainty, I knew we had crossed a line we could never truly uncross. I didn't notice her arrive until she was standing at the doorway, coat dripping rain onto the welcome mat. Her hair stuck to her forehead, and there was a weight in her eyes I hadn't seen before. I gestured to the chair across from me, but she didn't sit right away. Instead, she leaned against the frame, silent for a long moment, as if deciding whether she could share something she'd kept locked away for years. "I haven't talked about him in a long time," she said finally, voice low, almost hesitant. Not to anyone. And maybe I shouldn't, not now. But she trailed off, letting the words hang between us like smoke. I kept my hands folded, trying to give her space, but my chest ached to lean forward, to let her know she could. It's okay, I murmured, softer than I intended. You can tell me. Her gaze dropped to the floor. When she spoke again, it was almost a whisper. He left me when I thought we'd have everything. Years of promises. And then nothing. Just empty space. She swallowed, and for the first time, I saw her vulnerability raw, unguarded. The usual calm that surrounded her had slipped, leaving only someone fragile, human, real. I reached for a notebook on the desk, thumb brushing a folded corner, and suddenly there it was, a small, worn photograph tucked inside. I picked it up without thinking, glancing at the image, a man who looked familiar, impossibly so, though I couldn't place him. Her hand hovered over mine as I held it, hesitant, almost protective. That's him, she said softly, eyes fixed on the photograph. My mistake. My regret. Sometimes I see him in the wrong faces, in strangers, even in you, maybe. And I hate it, because you're different. Her voice caught, breaking the rhythm of the rain outside, and I realized how much she feared the pull between us, even as it drew her closer. I wanted to say something to steady her, to tell her she didn't have to carry that alone, but instead I only said, I'm here. My voice felt small, inadequate, but it was all I had. She leaned back slightly, closing her eyes for a moment, and I noticed the faint tremor in her hands. It's strange, she murmured. I've spent so long thinking I'd never want anything like this again. But her eyes opened slowly, meeting mine with a careful intensity that made my pulse hammer. I think I'm scared of how much I already do. The words hung between us, heavier than the storm outside. I wanted to reach across, to brush her hair back, to close the space that felt electric, but I didn't. I simply sat, letting the moment stretch, letting her trust me enough to let the truth spill out. She smiled faintly then, fragile, almost broken, and for a heartbeat I saw both her strength and her fear intertwined. I'm not asking for anything, she said, voice trembling. I just needed you to know. I nodded, feeling something shift inside me, subtle but seismic. It wasn't a confession of desire or love, yet, but it changed the space between us. Something unspoken had finally landed, leaving both of us altered. When she finally rose, I noticed how she lingered in the doorway, hand brushing the frame. Be careful with me, she said quietly, almost to herself, almost a warning. And then she was gone, leaving me with a photograph, a pulse that wouldn't settle, and the quiet realization that nothing would ever feel ordinary again. The rain had stopped by the time I saw her again, but the air smelled damp and electric, like it had been waiting for us. We were both quiet as we worked side by side, stacking books, sorting papers, performing small, mundane tasks that suddenly felt intimate. The office no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like the space we had carved out together, suspended from the rest of the world. She didn't speak first. Neither did I. And yet, every glance, every shift of weight, every brush of fingers against the same folder said more than words could. She paused, hand hovering over a stack of journals, and I realized she was waiting for me to meet her honesty halfway. I didn't know how much I needed someone to notice, she murmured finally, her voice softer than the morning light filtering through the window. Not just my work, not just what I do, but me. All of it. I didn't respond immediately. I only glanced at her, taking in the faint curve of her jaw, the way her hair fell across her forehead, the quiet tremor in her fingers. And I understood. I understood the weight she carried, the careful walls she had built, and the courage it took just to let me see them. You don't have to say anything, I whispered, though my voice sounded steadier than I felt. I see it. I see you. She smiled then, small, almost shy, and the tension that had hovered between us for weeks began to shift, subtly, irrevocably. She leaned back slightly, but didn't move away. I could feel her presence in a way that no words could define. Quiet, steady, inevitable. For a moment, we worked in silence. letting the world shrink to the small circle of space we shared. And then, almost without thinking, our hands brushed. Not deliberately, but deliberately enough that neither of us pulled away. Her palm pressed lightly against mine, warm and familiar, a small bridge across the distance we had maintained for so long. "I guess some things are impossible to fight," she said softly, almost to herself. "Even if we tried." I nodded, and she looked up, meeting my gaze with something unspoken. Acknowledgement, trust, understanding. No declarations, no grand gestures. Just the quiet recognition that we had arrived somewhere we hadn't named, but both understood. We continued working, our hands occasionally brushing over the same papers, sharing the small space without pretense or urgency. The office felt lighter, calmer, charged yet steady. I noticed the faint lines around her eyes, the warmth of her shoulder when we shifted side by side, the way she laughed quietly at something trivial. I didn't want to speak. I didn't need to. Finally, she leaned her head slightly against my shoulder. Not a demand, not an announcement, just a gentle settling into the moment. I could feel her breathe, steady and real, and I rested my cheek lightly against her hair, letting the silence speak for both of us. No words were needed. No promises. Just two people who had survived hesitation, fear, and the gravity of their own hearts. And yet, in that quiet closeness, everything had changed. I squeezed her hand once, just enough to let her know I was there, and she responded with a faint, almost imperceptible squeeze back. That small gesture carried everything: trust, relief, understanding, and the simple, unshakable fact that we had found each other. And in the quiet that followed, I knew we didn't need more. It was enough. It had always been enough. Looking back, it's strange how quiet everything felt after it finally settled. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a gentle shift, like the world finally made sense in small, almost imperceptible ways. She was no longer just the woman who had startled me with a single sentence, or the one who carried the weight of old heartbreak. She was someone I understood, and someone who understood me. I noticed things I hadn't before. The subtle strength in her hands, the way she laughed when no one else was around, the small habits that made her human and alive. She noticed me too, how my shoulders slumped when I was tired, how my eyes lingered on things I shouldn't, how I carried small anxieties like invisible backpacks. And we accepted it. Not perfectly, not magically, but fully. We worked side by side often, though work had become incidental. The books, the papers, the ordinary tasks, they were the backdrop for something more important, the quiet presence of someone who mattered. We didn't need words to measure what we felt. A brush of fingers, a glance, a shared silence carried the weight of honesty and trust. Love, I've realized, doesn't always announce itself with fireworks or declarations. Sometimes it sneaks in quietly, persistent and patient, leaving small markers that you only recognize when you stop and look back. In her, I found something I didn't know I'd been missing. Not perfection, not safety, but presence. Full presence. And in me, she found patience, attention, and the willingness to see without judgment. It hasn't been flawless. We stumble, hesitate, and sometimes doubt ourselves. But there's a rhythm now, a delicate, steady understanding that didn't exist before. We've learned that closeness doesn't erase fear. It transforms it into something we can carry together. I remember the first time she leaned against my shoulder, and how my heart almost betrayed me with relief and awe at the same time. That tiny gesture, repeated in different ways every day, became our language. It's not cinematic, not loud, but it's ours. Every pause, every unspoken thought, every quiet acknowledgement of presence feels like a victory. And I've come to appreciate the beauty in that quietness. The stormy nights, the hesitant touches, the awkward pauses, all of it built something stronger than words could ever convey. She taught me that love isn't always about action or speech. Sometimes it's about holding a space for someone else and letting them hold one for you in return. Now, when I look at her across the room, sorting books, adjusting a display, laughing at something small, I feel the weight of everything that brought us here. The longing, The hesitations, the unspoken confessions, all of it led to this steady, earned closeness that neither of us takes for granted. And maybe that's the lesson. Love doesn't always arrive with drama. Sometimes it comes quietly, persistently, and when you finally notice it, you realize it was there all along. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?